beautiful farm. It's very well endowed with great soils, and the thought of this being developed was upsetting.
Chris Cashin says his vegetable farm, the farm at Miller's Crossing in Columbia County, has been in business for 20 years. About 5 years ago, his family started leasing an extra 397 acres of land for their business, but then he heard the owners had plans to sell the property.
The security of it was tenuous, and if we didn't come up with a long-term ownership situation, planning on this being here for ourselves might prove to be, something that didn't work out.
But things are working out. State Agriculture Commissioner Richard Ball announced Tuesday the farm at Miller's Crossing is one of 28 farms in the Hudson Valley that will be permanently protected from future development.
Well, this land is under a permanent easement now, okay? So the development rights have been exchanged for some cash for this farm to continue.
The Hudson Valley Agricultural Enhancement Program provides money to local partners like municipalities and land trusts to purchase land easements to protect properties from becoming anything other than farmland.
We're beginning to think about the entire region as our regional food shed. And if we nurture and support all of the farms in the region together, then the farm economy holds together.
Cashin says this protection will help his farm continue to be successful for years to come.
Be able to invest in the business as well as the infrastructure that came with the farm. We hope to have a roadside farm stand here, and that's probably one of the things we're most excited about in the immediate future.
In Columbia County, Candace Dunkley, Time Warner Cable News.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for coming to our Food Policy for Breakfast seminar series. I want to welcome everyone here to Hunter College in East Harlem. My name is Charles Platkin, and I am the director of the New York City Food Policy Center at Hunter College and a professor here. Today, we're honored to have several impressive and distinguished guests. And I guess we're missing a few people because of the rain. We did get 300 RSVPs, but I think that we'll still get some people coming. We have Steve Rosenberg, Senior Vice President at Scenic Hudson and the Executive Director at the Scenic Hudson Land Trust. Karen Washington, owner and farmer at Rise and Root Farm. New York State Assemblywoman Dee Dee Barrett. New York State Council Member Dan Garodnick. And Chris Cashin from Miller's Crossing. And you saw two of those people on the video that we just saw. I want to take time to thank all of the panelists to come out here on their busy schedules to be here today. And a special thanks to Steve Rosenberg, our presenter today, who's going to give us a brief overview of the Hudson Valley and farms. And Steve helped to initiate, plan, and invite the guest speakers for today. Not all the guests, though. Making my job particularly simple, so thank you, Steve. And I want to give him a warm welcome and the panelists today, and Steve's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Charles. Everybody here okay? Great. Well, I just want to make a brief presentation about some of the background of what it means to conserve a farm and what the region of the Hudson Valley means to New York City in terms of providing fresh local food. The premise is really, and it's exemplified on this slide, that if the city wants to have access to local and regional food, it seems obvious, but it has to come from nearby farms. So, if it's from the Midwest, it's not going to be local or regional. And that we can't take that for granted. The dots on the map are farms that currently sell to New York City green markets. And of course, there are many, many other outlets in the city for local and regional food, but it just gives you an indication. And there are more farms in the Hudson Valley serving green markets than from any other area surrounding the city. So just try to imagine if you went to your local farmer's market on a Saturday morning or a Thursday after work, and all the vendors' tents were empty because those little dots didn't exist on the map. So we all know there's a tremendous amount of demand for fresh local food in the city, whether it's in schools and institutions, whether it's urban food deserts where fresh local food is not available as much as people would like, or the incredible city's culinary economy revolving around its restaurants. The mythology is that culinary economy is where most of the local and regional food ends up, and that it's far too expensive for average New Yorkers to be able to afford. And I think one of the things we'd like to do today is make sure that people understand that local and regional food is actually making its way into many different parts of the city. Most of the people on the panel today can attest to that, and some of them are making that actually happen. Karen and Chris in particular. But demand alone is not going to make sure that we continue to have access to this food, and actually that over time, perhaps we can have even more food. The agricultural land being in place is critical to making sure, of course, we have food. We hear a lot, see the bumper sticker sometimes that says, no farms, no food. Sort of take it back one more step and say, no farmland, no farms. And when people talk about a sustainable regional food system, you often hear about different public policy initiatives and making sure farmers can compete, and effective marketing and distribution networks. These are all important, they're critical, but the missing piece in many of these conversations is making sure that the land base is there as well. I think there are a lot of either misconceptions or just people don't really understand or know what it means when we say we're going to save this farm, or we're going to conserve this farm, or we're going to protect this farm. What does that actually mean? I represent a land trust, a nonprofit conservation organization, and in the Hudson Valley there may be a dozen land trusts who work with local farmers to help them conserve their farms. And what it means is the land trust doesn't actually buy and own the farm. The land trust purchases the development rights from the farmer for cash, and the farmer continues to own the farm, but the farmer makes a permanent commitment that that farm and the farmland will always be available for agriculture. It can't be put to a different use. And the farmer is paid the difference, which is usually about 40 to 60% of the total value of the property, the difference between what it's worth on the open market and what it's worth, which is going to be less if it's subject to these restrictions. So he or she could never sell it to a developer, for example. And the easement also, a conservation easement is placed on the land. It protects the natural resources, it protects the agricultural soils, sensitive areas, and as Chris said in the video, it gives the farmer money to be able to invest in the future of the farm. So, so we have these tools like conservation easements, we have willing farmers, we have demand in the city. How do we actually make sure that the farms in the Hudson Valley, which are so important to providing food to the city, are going to be there? So the state has a program, and that video talked about a $20 million commitment that Governor Cuomo made a year and a half ago to Hudson Valley Farms. The federal government has a program, but who knows what's going to happen there in the future. We have these land trusts who are in place. We have a lot of farmers who would like to conserve their farms. And one, what this discussion about this morning is, what is New York City's role in helping to conserve the farms that provide fresh local food to the city? And to think about it perhaps in a way very similar to the way the city has been investing for more than 20 years to secure its supply of clean drinking water by paying to conserve land around New York City's reservoirs in the Hudson Valley and in the Catskills. So, thank you, and I guess on with the questions.
So I think what we'll do is, if you could each just introduce yourselves, that would be great, and just talk about your relationship to New York City State Regional Farms.
And I've been a participant in the effort that Steve talked about to try to have New York City help in the conservation of our regional farms, and I'll be happy to talk about that in greater detail.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Assemblymember Dee Dee Barrett, and I have the great pleasure of representing a district with lots of farms. It's the beautiful 106th Assembly District in the Hudson Valley, which is roughly the northern half of Dutchess County and the southern half of Columbia County. Can I just ask for a show of hands, how many people have been to the Hudson Valley here today? Oh, good. Okay, great. So you know how incredible it is, and not only is this area beautiful now, it's historic and was the breadbasket of the the young nation for a long time and has continued to be a really important part of the economy of New York and the kinds of farms, as you'll hear from the farmers here, that I believe are truly the future of agriculture, not just in New York State, but in our country, and these are small and mid-sized family farms. I have served on the Agriculture Committee, as well as the Economic Development and Environmental Conservation Committee, so these issues are obviously very dear to my heart. And when the city council member and Scenic Hudson first initiated this effort to try to get money in the New York City budget, I pulled together a group of my colleagues who represent districts in New York City, and I sought specifically the New York City women members, because so often women are the food deciders in the family and make those choices. So we wrote a letter, there were probably about 15 of us that signed on asking for this support from New York City, and we will continue that effort in the next budget cycles going forward. So I too look forward to answering any questions and this discussion. Thanks.
My name is Chris Cashin. My wife Katie and I own and operate the farm at Miller's Crossing in Clobbersburg, which is in the district that Dee Dee was referring to. We have about 400 acres of land under cultivation for various vegetable crops, beef, maple syrup, bedding plants. And about 10 years ago, we had kind of reached a frustrating point in our sales where we felt vulnerable to brokers, but felt like we really needed to start going into the city to try to get a direct market for our product. We were introduced to several programs and CSAs through Just Food, which is a not-for-profit in Manhattan. And 10 years later, about 9 years later, we were doing very well and using a lot of land, some of which we did not own. And it became clear to us that in order to continue this relationship that we had developed in the city, that we had to secure our ownership of the land that we were farming. There was the threat of development on the land that was in this little video. And amazingly, through the help of Scenic Hudson, Equity Trust, and the Columbia Land Conservancy, and a lot of other people, we were able to pull off a deal that protected the farm and gave us equity, which has allowed us to really look ahead to the future and begin the next phase of our business.
So, good morning, I'm Karen Washington. So, where can I begin? I'm both an urban farmer and a rural farmer. It's really important to understand exactly where food comes from. At one time, I was the president of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, which is an organization that's out there to preserve community gardens here in New York City. We have over 600 community gardens. In 2014, I met Steve Rosenberg, who was telling me that he was head of an organization that was preserving land upstate. So there was sort of this mutual understanding of the importance of preserving land, both in New York City and upstate, and the importance of people understanding where the food comes from. As a result of doing urban agriculture in New York City, me and my friends decided to dream big and think about expanding and going upstate to find some land. And at one time was very, very difficult, but again, through making connection with Steve and Bob Bernstein at that time, in 2014, we were able to lease 3 acres of land up in Chester, New York, where we are now. It's called Rise and Root Farm. So we continue to have that connection between upstate and downstate, and the importance of the regional food system, understanding that here in the city, people want to farm, both in urban and rural areas, but also that there's a need for land. I think the biggest asset that we have is the increased interest in people understanding where their food comes from and consumers connecting with the farmers and vice versa.
And I've already been somewhat introduced, but I guess the additional piece I'll talk about is what underpins our conservation efforts in the Hudson Valley at Scenic Hudson around farmland is something called our New York City Hudson Valley Food Shed Conservation Plan. And this was funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation several years ago. And it's really a first of its kind strategic conservation plan identifying and prioritizing the important farms and farmland in a large metropolitan region's food shed. And this has been the basis for other land trusts in the Hudson Valley, the county farmland protection boards, and New York State to all have a common frame of reference about what the most important farms and farmland are. And it's based on the soil quality, the size of the farm, and the geographic relationship of the farms to one another. So by having this, we don't just have a sort of an ad hoc approach to farms. A farmer calls and says, you know, can you help me save our farm? Or someone calls and says, the land across the street is about to be developed. This way, if you're a public policy maker like Assemblywoman Barrett or Councilmember Garodnick, and you're thinking about allocating public funds to help save these farms, you know it's based on a rational, objective approach. And it was based on that Governor Cuomo put $20 million of the bank settlement funds in 2015 into the budget specifically for this purpose.
Thank you all. That was great. So I guess, you know, the first question is kind of the title of today's event, and I guess you covered that to some degree about, you know, why the average New Yorker should care about upstate farms. And I guess just opening that up to the panel to maybe respond. Why is it so important? We're getting some of our food, all of our food. I mean, we know the importance of Hunts Point. We, you know, sort of it's been ingrained that 60% of our food supply comes from Hunts Point. Can you sort of tell us more about that? About why we should, anybody?
Well, I'll lead off. I mean, on the you know, you raised the question about how much food can actually be supplied to the city from family farms in the Hudson Valley. And somebody actually from University of California did a study a couple of years ago and said that if all of the farmland in the metro region was optimized, it could provide actually about 30% of the city's food. I'm not sure we're ever going to reach that, but I think the key question is there's probably no single source that's going to provide all of the city's food. But if we want to, for all the reasons we've talked about, continue to have access to fresh local food and make it more accessible to people, that simply can't happen without the preservation of these farms.
And I would add that when you see the decrease in the overall number of farms, and you see the increase in demand from New York City, and the increase in the number of local farmers markets, and the increase in our population in New York City. We just had a hearing yesterday about traffic and congestion. And you know, the fact that people just can't move around in New York City because, you know, well, there's a variety of reasons, which I won't bore you with today. There'll be another panel. But we have a lot of demand. And we'll either continue to rely on corporate farms where there's a lot of travel involved in an environmentally unfriendly way of operating, or we will protect these local farms, which are right here, and that we should make sure don't get overwhelmed by development pressure. So New Yorkers should really care about this. It is good for the environment, it's good for resiliency, it builds on successes that we've had in the watershed. So, you know, I think, you know, when you take a step back and say, okay, well, why would New York City residents use their own tax dollars to help protect farms in the Hudson Valley? Well, when you consider the fact that this is should be part of our aspiration and our policy goals, and also, by the way, it is local law to procure local food, and that is part of our actual local law to actually find it and get it, that it becomes a lot more obvious.
I would also add that people care where their food comes from. People want to know, I mean, as speaking as a mother, but I know fathers care as much, and people who don't have children and are putting food into their own mouths care where their food is coming from. I mean, we've had enough scares across the world where people don't know what's caused Ebola or other kinds of, you know, diseases that are foodborne or, you know, infections, other things. But people want to know. They want to meet the farmer. They want to know what they're buying. They want to know how it was grown. there's a personal connection to food that people have and want to have more of, and that can only happen when you're doing this in a local way and you're supporting the economy of the state. I mean, this is local economy. This is sort of basic to making sure that we have a sustainable and vital future for the city and the state of New York.
So what are the arguments that have come up, against supporting? I mean, it seems like, I guess people could say that we have so many of our own issues. Have you had resistance in the city council, or from, you don't have to say who, from whom, but just, is there resistance? Did they look, when this was brought up, was it looked at like, are you kidding me, right? Or was it sort of taken like, hey, this is a good point, like we did with the watershed?
Well, the first instinct is, I don't get it, because it's not intuitive. If you haven't thought about it, you wouldn't gravitate towards spending New York City tax dollars anywhere but in New York City. But when you look at the overall demand and our needs and how we can protect ourselves, you can't just look at the borders of New York City. You have to look much more broadly than that. And if we don't, then we're going to have challenges. I mean, if you consider our drinking water as just a perfect example, New York City had the foresight to protect the watershed, the area around our reservoirs, to protect from development and the challenges that that would bring, or the vulnerability that that would bring to our water system. That's not within within the 5 boroughs of New York City, but it had a direct, call it a strategic interest for New York City, and we wisely spent money to be able to create some easements over the watershed. Same thing is true here, and if you recognize the demand and also the challenges of moving food around and bringing it from all the way across the country and world versus the opportunities that you have to be able to move at a much shorter distance. And by the way, after Sandy, we were relying on that rather significantly when nobody could actually get in and out. It becomes more obvious. We still have work to do, obviously. It's not yet in the budget. And we have to move that conversation and make sure people understand why this is a parallel to the watershed, why this is in New York's strategic interest, and why we need to spend some level of taxpayer funds to be able to get it done.
And Assemblywoman Barrett, do you think that the state, how has the reception been to the state? I know that Governor Cuomo has thought about New York State farmers, but this has been going on before that. What's been the reception, and how has that traveled then?
I think there's increasing recognition about the synergy between New York City, which, as the Ag Commissioner likes to call the biggest appetite in the world, which we have right at our back door in the Hudson Valley, but the state as a whole, and I think increasing the profile of agriculture as an economic driver is important. It should match what the reality is. It's we think of ourselves as a financial center and an entertainment center and all of these things, but the role of agriculture is really up there. If you link it with tourism, it's even greater. So I think the state appreciates that and recognizes that, and it's something that from the very first time that I was elected, my first hours on the floor of the assembly, I shared with my colleagues from New York City, which is the majority of the conference that I represent, I'm a Democrat, that my constituents are feeding their constituents, and that we are inextricably linked. I mean, that's the issues that affect my district, and I was and am the first Democrat to represent most of my area, so that kind of rural community that voice was pretty new to a lot of my colleagues from New York City when I was first elected, and there are a few others of us as well now. But that wasn't a hard lesson for people to learn, and as their constituents are clamoring for more farmers markets or farmers markets in their neighborhoods, or are participating in CSAs, or are starting farms upstate and doing like what Karen's doing, I think just the awareness is increasing, and I personally believe that we have to think much more holistically as a state. We're not an upstate, downstate, we're New York State, and I believe that there is the support for this. We have a very engaged agricultural ag and markets commissioner right now who's been very much about getting New York City institutions to buy from farmers upstate, and has done a number of rounds of bringing state agencies up to Hudson Valley Farms to make those connections and make sure that, that continues to grow. So I think there's definitely a will.
Thank you. And then, Chris and Karen, as farmers, how is this, I mean, Karen, it seems like you came into this because of the program, and Chris, it seems like it impacted you as an existing farmer. Could you tell some more about that?
Yes, so I think the point has been made. The biggest challenge that we have is hunger and poverty, and it affects both urban areas and rural areas. And I think that's the common denominator when it comes to food, that poor people, regardless of where they live, there is a need for them to have fresh, local produce. And so what you're starting to see is this sort of common denominator of people understanding and wanting to know where their food comes from, wanting to meet the farmers, or encouraging farmers from upstate to come into low-income neighborhoods and inner cities, so that we have a chance to do that. I mean, there's this so big hype that urban agriculture is going to feed everything and everybody, and no, that's not the point, because what it has done is unlock Pandora's box, and it's given people a chance to understand the importance of eating fresh produce. And so the inner cities, the impoverished communities are grateful that farmers in New York State are coming down into our areas to provide food that is fresh and local. And I think that's something that is missing in the conversation when we try to separate urban and rural. The common denominator is food. And my job as a farmer up in Rising Root is to continue to do that, to grow food so that everybody, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their economics, have a chance to eat food that is fresh and local, and that's important.
Yeah, I would echo the same thing, and as I mentioned, we were fortunate enough to find a program through Just Food and United Way and New York State Ag and Markets, which has us bringing about 30,000 pounds of pre-contracted food into food pantries. And this is strictly fresh food that we deliver on a weekly basis into Long Island City. As these opportunities have come our way, the need to have more land to grow more food to meet the demand. The longer we've been in business, I feel very fortunate to have been coming into farming in the late 90s and into the current time when there is so much awareness and so much excitement and enthusiasm, both from customers and from state and federal government and not-for-profits and land trust. But without that land secure to grow the food on, farmers can lease, but we are an organic farm. We have 5-year crop rotations that require careful planning, and the inputs that we have in the farm take many years to get back. And so you really can't run this operation on a yearly lease situation. It just isn't sustainable. So having these outside agencies and not-for-profit groups come into our assistance to help us with security, the land security, it's a really big economic issue for farmers upstate to know that the land isn't going to be taken away from them for whatever, whether it's another farmer or it's a developer or whatever.
Do you mind just elaborating a little bit, for instance, start from how many acres do you have? How did this program help you? Just give those details. And how did it work? And did you have to struggle to get it? And how much, if it's publicly available, the money that was given? And
yeah, so we were, back in 2003, we were overproducing. We didn't have enough customers. We had reached a point where we kind of figured our production end of it, and then the marketing wasn't keeping up. And farming typically is, you never have just enough. You either have too much or you don't have enough. Right now, case in point, we don't have enough. Without the sun, we haven't been able to really pick any substantial amount of vegetables. So I can be here talking and not worrying about the harvest today. But So we reached that point where we were really plowing crops under, and that's a really terrible place to be. You've invested all your time and energy and seed and labor, and then you have nothing to show for it. So in kind of a desperate move, we looked around and we spoke to Just Food, and we actually sat down with them. They came to the farm, and we looked at it, and they had a program called Local Produce Link, and they also wanted us to be looking to start the traditional CSA models in areas that were underserved. And so we ended up going into Long Island City, which it wasn't really a gentrified, hot market, but it was something that they wanted us there to try to establish a foothold and start bringing in the food in addition to the food pantry delivery. The following year, we ended up going into Flatbush, Brooklyn, and then the following year, we went to Fort Greene, Brooklyn. So now, and then we have Prospect Lefferts Garden as well. So in the course of 5 years, we picked up 800 CSA members, which in and of itself is a business model for a farm like ours to run. And so we just said yes, 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 because this is what we wanted. And then we got to this point where we're up and running, and then we're looking around saying, this is great, but it's tenuous because some of this land that we're producing on really doesn't belong to us. So at that point in time, we
Sorry,
owned,
could you just explain that part of it, and also how many acres are we talking about?
yeah, so we owned 200 acres. That was our family farm. And of that 200, about 50 of them were prime vegetable soil that you could plow and irrigate and grow vegetables on. In order to do the crops that we grow, you really need water, you need flat ground, you need well-drained soils, relatively stone-free. So we started renting an additional 50 acres of land down the road from us, which belonged to another farmer who was a dairy farmer. The dairy economy collapsed. In 2000, there was 5 dairy farms within a mile of my farm. I could get free cow manure. I could, have neighbors make hay for me. Today, there are none. There's not a single dairy cow in my town. And so this vacuum of land ownership and farming happened, and we decided to try to secure that ownership, and at that point reached out and bumped into Scenic Hudson and Columbia Land Conservancy, and we were able to secure 69 acres that we had been leasing prior, which allowed us to really confidently say to our members in the city that, we're not going to go away. We're not, even if that land had been sold, we would not have been able to maintain that 1,000 member CSA that we had developed.
And so part of how that works is, so if the land that Chris was looking to buy, let's say, on the open market costs $10, but there's no way a farmer could afford to pay $10 for that land as agricultural land. The purchase price for the conservation easement, say, is half of that, $5. Now Chris can afford to pay it because the price for the piece of land is going to be to him only $5.
Gotcha, no, that makes sense. And has there been any arrangement, like for loans for even for the $5, from banks, or theoretically for that half? Do you guys work with farmers to help secure financing?
We have done that in certain situations. The group that Chris mentioned, Equity Trust, is another nonprofit that works with farmers and land trusts, and on occasion makes zero or low interest loans to farmers to bridge them before they can apply for public funding for an easement or help them to get off the ground. There are a handful of other sources, but I would say we probably need more of that kind of funding to help farmers.
Yeah, and to make another point, Equity Trust in this particular instance purchased a preemptive right to determine who the next owner is. So we benefited from these public and private monies, to get our operation to where we needed to be to protect the land. But we also have agreed and sold the rights to determine who the next buyer is. So when we're done farming, whether it's our children or when we sell the farm, there is a stipulation in the contract that says this has to be sold to a bona fide farmer, which to us was really incredibly important, because otherwise it really would have been just a windfall for us to say, well, we got this land and we were able to get assistance for it, but it kind of perpetuates this idea that this will always be in the hands of a real productive farmer.
Can I just add, I think that's such an important point, because for so long people talked about, just open space or for farmland protection, and if we're not protecting it to be farmland, we're just giving people lots of opportunity to get tax breaks for owning more and more land, we're not accomplishing any of the really key goals here. And just as a couple of figures from the American Farmland Trust, since the 1980s, more than 4,000 farms, and this is just in New York, have been lost to real estate development, and that less than 5% of the farmland is permanently protected in New York, and that over 4,000 farms have been paved over in the last 3 decades, which is that first figure as well, but that greater than 80% of the fruits and vegetables, and many of those are in the Hudson Valley, are grown on threatened farmland. So this is not kind of a theoretical issue. This is a timely, current, and very profound issue for all of us.
Can you talk about that threatened, for a moment? Just expand on that.
So threatened to development. Obviously, we've gone through decade more or less of a iffy economy, and it was a bit of a reprieve. But I think as the economy seems to be growing now, I certainly see across my district little shopping centers popping up. The desire for developers to come in and say, I mean, this is, as we all acknowledge, this is a gorgeous area. It's easy access to New York City, to Boston. It's it's a place people want to live. Fortunately, we haven't gotten very good broadband yet, so it's not so good for businesses. That's a mixed bag. But it's this is you can see the risk and at the cost in this. You see this happening on Long Island, where this incredible farmland that supported so much of the economy for so long, it just has become big estates, and the land is protected for more big estates. We need working farmland, and what Chris was talking about, and ensuring that young farmers, and this is other issues that we've been working on, that young farmers have access to the good farmland is really important, because that's the future of agriculture.
So this is a serious problem right now, right here. I mean, right, we need to be
Yes.
concerned right now.
Another threat is the fact that we have an aging population of farmers. The average age of a farmer, I think, has gone from maybe 57 to 58 years of age. And so how do we make room and land available for the next wave of young farmers? And that needs to be considered. If we don't have land that's preserved, if we don't have land that will allow young people to either own or lease for long periods of time, then that's going to be a problem. At Chester Agricultural Center, we were lucky to be able to have a 30-year lease. I won't be around in 30 years, I don't think, but at least, I mean, it's unheard of something like, it's unheard of to have that long of a lease, and I think that's important, that when we're looking at land, that there's options not only for young farmers to purchase land, but if there is a way for land to be leased, it should be leased for long periods of time.
Yeah, this really is a moment, as the other speakers have said, it's sort of the last best chance, I think, for the Hudson Valley. The threat of sort of what I call death by 1,000 cuts, all these little minor development projects that happen in and around active farms, each one of them makes it more difficult for that farmer to continue to farm. And then you also have this conversion of farms to estates, as was being talked about. And so what happens there is you have the prices rising to where there is no possibility that a farmer can afford that farm. And those two things together add up to this scenario where you go to your farmer's market in the city and the farmers just aren't going to be there.
There are two issues that were brought up. One is attracting young farmers, and the second is, let's say there are farmers even in New York City that want to own, move upstate and develop a farm. What can they do, and who do they go to? Thank you. And who do they go to in order to be able to, buy land, or other than going online and looking for a, real estate broker or something like that? Are there programs in place to develop young farmers, to give them access to land and so forth?
There are, and the Hudson Valley is increasingly rich with opportunities in this area. The Glenwood Institute, and the directors here in the audience, is a terrific resource for young farmers. There are farmer incubator programs that are in place there, at another place called the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Ulster County. Places like Stone Barns help to train farmers. And then there are a lot of agricultural economic development opportunities. But I think, like so many other things in our society, they're tremendously under-resourced in terms of their ability to serve the need. And I think, as Chris and Karen both said, for them, reaching out to a land conservation group, talking to their local assembly people and state senators, and the state legislature and the governor have been very supportive of this and increased the funding over time, but it's nowhere near what needs to happen. That said, prices in the Hudson Valley are remarkably reasonable still in the scheme of things. If you look at Long Island, you're talking about multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars an acre. In the Hudson Valley, you're talking about between $3,000 and $12,000 an acre typically. Those days are not going to come around again. And so the commitment of public and private funds at all levels at the same time is really what we need.
So are there plans to potentially, buy huge tracts of land like they did? I mean, I may not be getting this right, but like we did with the watershed, I mean, is there anything in the works, or is it?
So there is a proposal that we have been pushing with Assemblywoman Barrett and also Scenic Hudson, which would have New York City actually buying conservation easements around in the Hudson Valley for the purpose of helping with the economics that you heard about, and also protecting our food shed. And the proposal is for New York City to put aside $5 million a year over 10 years, and to make sure that we endeavor to protect these farms and to protect New York's strategic interests. So that is an outstanding proposal. It is not one which is in the budget that we are voting on today, this afternoon, actually, at 1 o'clock. In case anybody wants to come down to City Hall, we'll be voting on the city budget. But it is one which is a live issue and one that we have been able to move considerably as a result of our starting to educate people about why this is important. Now, there is a legal issue here, which is an important one for people to understand also, that we can't just give money to private enterprises. New York City can't do it, New York State can't do it either. We have to make sure that when we are buying a conservation easement, that it has a direct connection to New York City, and that we were able to make that nexus clear. So if a certain number of these farms are actually supplying farmers markets in New York City would be an obvious one. The general policy goal of protecting food shed may be make it a little less clear about the nexus. We have to establish that clear nexus between the farms that we're protecting and New York City. And that's one of the outstanding issues beyond just educating people why this is in any way important to New York City, is to establish that clear connection between what we are doing and the food that is delivered to New York City farmers markets and to the tables of New York City residents. But there is this proposal. It's one that I would strongly encourage people. We are about to have a mayoral election to make this an issue, if it's important to you, because this is the moment when people are paying the most attention to what people are concerned about. And I would strongly encourage that you make your voices heard on this one.
Thanks. So with this, I guess I wonder, with the watershed, did New York State actually buy the land on easements, or is it the same thing?
It's both, actually.
It's both, okay.
And they're buying easements through a nonprofit group called the Watershed Agricultural Council from farmers who own land in and around the reservoirs, not in the reservoirs, around the reservoirs. And they're also purchasing other tracts where their land is right on the reservoir and it's important for the city to own it.
So is New York State or New York City thinking about that as well, or that has actual buying land?
In this context of protecting the food shed, we're not talking about the city actually buying land, just helping to pay the price to conserve the land. And the proposal has been that the city would only pay a fraction of the total cost. The city's money would leverage state money, some towns and counties have funding, private contributions, and federal money. So that every dollar of city money would go quite a long distance. And the point that Councilmember Garodnick raised about that direct connection, the idea was to have a contractual relationship where the farmer was selling to, like Chris's, a food pantry or another institution in the city, or a farmer's market arrangement to document that.
And what is the scope of the problem? Meaning, how much money is needed, and how much, how many farms are affected, and so forth?
So there's a total of more than 5,000 active working farms in the Hudson Valley. This is a lot more than just taking your family to go apple picking in the fall. And they provide, as Karen and Chris have talked about, a whole range of foods to the entire spectrum of people who live in New York City. Our food shed plan analysis prioritized the farms, and there are around 600 farms that fall into the category of sort of highest priority. If we were going to just try to conserve, and you don't have to conserve every last farm, what you have to conserve is this sort of local farm ecosystem, so that when a farmer needs a loan from someone, the lender is going to feel confident that that farming economy is sound. When a farmer wants to make investments, they feel that the farms nearby have made a commitment to farming. When a company's going to sell supplies or seed or equipment to farmers, there's enough business there for them to keep doing that. So to conserve, say, just example, a third of the highest priority farms in the Hudson Valley, which would make a huge, huge impact, that would cost about $250 million, we estimate. So if you take that over 10 years, for example, and the city's contributing $5 million a year, the state has a program, the federal government has a program, local communities are contributing, and private philanthropy, that's an achievable goal.
And so a few things have to come into place before that can happen. And in terms of, one of the questions that we had talked about was how to get the word out there. I guess doing things like this, obviously, these kinds of events. But it would seem to me that with all the green, the Grow NYC, green markets, and like I'm around them, but I've never seen any presence around this issue. And I'm wondering, and that just could be me, but I'm wondering if there is these kinds of grassroots initiatives, and is that the way to go to try to get people to be more, conscious?
I mean, I think definitely. I think that's a very good thought. It's not something which has yet been done. But the idea that you could engage New York City residents at the place where they are most interested, at the moment when people running for office are most interested, itself is very wise. So the idea that you would, gather signatures or encourage people to, drop a note at a green market, or organize them to just sign something that can be sent on their behalf, I think is a really good idea. And it educates people, but it also shows elected officials that people care, they're paying attention, and that it is a really important thing for them to do.
I know on our part, the New York City Community Garden Coalition had asked Steve Rosenberg to come to one of the meetings to sort of outline exactly the importance of this sort of urban rural connection. I think the grassroots work is very, very important. I don't think we can sort of dismiss the fact that things are being done through the internet and Facebook. I think face-to-face with people, getting to understand exactly how it affects their lives is very, very important.
I think also the agricultural community is definitely catching on to this, and that's how I learned about it, was through press releases and learning about other farms in our area that receive federal or state monies to help protect their farm. And so this is a real economic thing for farms to stay viable, to have ownership of their land, or to reinvest in their business. And so the word is getting out really quickly, and a lot of real conventional dairy, grain, you name it, are starting to really look around and say, I'm sure Steve could list a number of projects that are, it's not just CSA vegetable farms and, direct marketed fruit. It's everybody. Milk, commodities, grains are all understanding that the government, whether it's state or federal, private, care, and maybe there's an opportunity for them to either expand or solidify their land base.
Yeah, and I would think that Grow NYC would have a very strong interest in helping farmers sustain their land.
Yeah, no, Grow NYC has been extremely supportive of the proposal, but within the sort of limits of what they can do, because they're directly tied to New York City government and they're not allowed publicly to advocate in certain respects about policy issues like this. And they also serve an area beyond the Hudson Valley, including Long Island and New Jersey and whatnot. So it makes it a little bit more complicated for them. But, you know, as I said before, the food policy groups in the city, until we started talking about this a few years ago, we're not thinking about the land part all that much. And there has been an education process going on because people, it is, as has been said here, not something that's been intuitive for people to think about. It's almost like, you know, you talk about kids going to the grocery store and you ask them where the food comes from and they think it's from the back room. And people go to the farmer's market, you know, and they just think, well, it comes from that vendor at that tent in the market. And this relationship between where the food comes from and the city is something we really need to deepen the public education about.
Yeah,
I just add one other thing. I mean, it happens in my district that there is certainly a chunk of people who have homes in New York City and also have homes in the Hudson Valley and shop in farmers markets probably in both places. So I think that's a population too that could be tapped into to kind of help build that nexus as well.
Yeah, I think that those are all, you know, really important points. So we're going to move to get some audience questions, but Chris, I've been worried since the whole time that your parking meter is up. And I'm nervous for you, and I've been nervous since you started. So can you go at least put that? And I could tell he was sitting there. Anyway, thanks. So I want to open it up to some questions.
New York City issue.
I wish we could give him special dispensation somehow.
I know you can't do that. So we'll start with Craig, who had the part one of this event at CUNY Food Policy Institute.
Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to preface my question by saying that I'm an ideological ally with, you know, many of the things that have been said on stage today. But the point I want to make is, with respect to preserving farms and growing agriculture in New York State, how does one make the argument that agriculture represents a unique space that needs to be protected when in the city, an analogous scenario with manufacturing, we've allowed so much manufacturing, well, not only in the city, in the country, to move abroad, and we've really kind of relegated ourselves to the fact that we're going to be a service economy. We're essentially going to depend on the financial industry and the service economy to largely drive the economic engine of the city. And when you have economies upstate where many people would be happy to get the construction jobs that come with development, to get the service jobs that come with commercial real estate being grown, how do you make the argument to those sorts of constituencies that this is something that's important, this is something that is really for your long-term benefit, that this is something that you need to understand is important for growing your economy versus construction jobs, service industry jobs, the sort of things that people are clamoring to have in many of the depressed communities upstate?
I don't know what's on your table every day, but on mine, it's food. And I think that that's one of the more fundamental pieces to this. This is what feeds our families, that helps us live. I mean, this is, you know, this is the staff of life. So, I mean, I think there's got to be room for all of that, but I think for too long we went with this notion that, you know, get big or get lost, the, you know, Earl Butz mindset that we could be growing things out of plastic bags because they're petroleum products and that kind of thing. And I don't think people are there anymore, and they don't really want that. So I mean, I think people want healthy, fresh food, people across the state in all communities. So that's just, you know, that's one of the basics, food, shelter, those kinds of things. And then these other pieces need to be worked in a way that creates a sustainable economy. But I mean, I think this is just basic.
I'd like to add, Chris, because you brought Craig, you brought a very a good point. I think the discussion needs to happen around the value of food. I think for too long, people just feel that food is a given, especially in communities where you see so much in terms of food pantries and soup kitchens. Something is lost in the translation about the value of food and what that means. And I think we need to have that conversation. We need to have the conversation about not only food, but water. And I think once we start having that conversation about the value of food and how it means, then I think people will understand that there needs to be a balance in terms of development and a food, preservation of food, and that the two can go hand in hand and work together. But I think what you say is right. We still need to have that conversation about the value of food, which in certain cases we don't.
And also, I would add that there's a complementary policy between goals of protecting manufacturing areas from development and protecting farms. In New York City, we have 22 or 25 industrial business zones, which have been designated because we are concerned that in the absence of creating incentives and limits to encourage manufacturing as opposed to just high-rise market rate residential development, which is probably the most profitable uses for those spaces, we are protecting certain areas as manufacturing zones, recognizing that New York City, speaking for New York City only here, has a need to ensure that we have spaces for those sorts of things. Same thing is true as a policy for allowing farmland to be protected from the pressures of development, and they are extreme pressures. So I think that there's a similarity between the goals of protecting manufacturing and the goals of protecting the farmland in this situation.
Yeah, I think we also have to think about what does the food economy itself add up to, and in a place like New York City, especially, Craig, if it goes in the direction you're talking about, where it's all about service and finance and not about manufacturing, the food economy is only going to grow. And if you talk about the food sector as a job generator, it's huge. And the job training opportunities are there as well, both within the city and in the valley.
Good morning. My name is Keith Carn with City Harvest, so of course I'd like to speak about affordability of produce. It's great that we're promoting local growing and local farmers and everything, but the reality is that local farmers, because the reality that they can't compete with farmers from Peru and everywhere else that our grocery stores get food from. So speaking to the legislators, I guess, what can we do through policy and advocacy to advocate for more subsidies for farmers so that local supermarkets will buy more locally? I know Grow NYC is doing some of those things. And then also through advocacy, I grew up in Connecticut. I was a Future Farmer of America. I was, vocational agriculture. New York City schools, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 schools that offer vocational agricultural curriculum. So what can we do to get those curriculums? Speaking to what Craig was saying, STEM is fantastic, but how about stirring up the future farmers that live in New York City, and then where are we going to have those jobs? They're going to be in Hudson Valley. They're going to be upstate. So you have a pipeline from New York City to farms upstate.
I can't speak to the education in New York City, but certainly I agree with you, and ag education is one of the issues that I feel very strongly about, and happen to have now, when I first started 5 years ago, 1 FFA school, now 2 FFA schools, and 4-H. I was just actually at their banquet the other night at Pine Plains High School. I think that the programs and there are a number of them in my district that are working with New York City schools, bringing kids to the Hudson Valley, Sylvia Center, others, those are our first step. There's certainly more that can be done with that. I think we talked at a panel once before. I think one of the challenges in general is understanding the fact that the food economy isn't based on reality, and the worker issues and the fair wages issues, all of those things are part of it. So, food doesn't cost basically what it really costs, and the subsidies that we see at the federal level is sustaining this mythology again that basically we should be supporting soybeans and corn and things that are going into our cars rather than going into our bellies. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen. I'm not so optimistic that's going to happen right now at the federal level, but hopefully more conversation here at the state level. But we did finally just get some tax credits for farmers to give to food banks. I mean, there are little things like that are Band-Aid solutions, but I think there definitely has to be a broader dialogue about how, because I do believe, as I said at the very beginning, I believe that the kinds of farms that we have in New York State is the future of agriculture. I mean, this is what we can replicate across the world, rather than than exclusively these big square state models. So and it requires the next generation being engaged and being educated and desiring to eat the kinds of healthy foods that hopefully they're being put on their tables right now. So I think there's a lot of different directions, but it definitely needs to be a collaborative effort of upstate and downstate entities working on it.
Yeah, I think there's, the bigger context is that I would argue that even in a traditional grocery store, the fresh produce, no matter where it comes from, typically is thought of by a lot of people as being more expensive and less accessible than packaged foods and processed foods in that grocery store. But within the sort of local and regional food system, you can either try to incentivize the farmer to pay more, or you can give the consumer additional dollars in their pocket so that they can pay more for the food that's for sale. And so the Food Bucks program and things like that are becoming increasingly available in outlets around the city is certainly helpful on the consumer side. For the farmers, I think making distribution easier, the cost for farmers in the region to transportation and distribution, transport their product into the city is tremendous. And Hunts Point has been set up not for small local farmers, but for much larger. And so if the regional food hub can actually be developed and put into place, and some of the barriers for farmers to be able to get into the city more easily can be lowered, then people like Chris and Karen, who already are bringing food into low-income neighborhoods on a regular basis, can be expanded.
I would like, as a farmer, to see that New York City provides more parking. I think the biggest problem that we have is getting tickets. That's number one. Paying the tolls. I mean, if there's some way that as a farmer we can get less in terms of paying tolls. I mean, it sounds silly, but those are some of the major obstacles that farmers have coming into New York City. It's parking and tolls. So some way politicians can help with that would be great.
We actually had a bill that almost that passed both houses that I introduced for over a couple of years to get tax credits on the throughway tolls. And the last round, the governor put it in the budget and then tried to expand it to include every corporate farm in the 3-state area or something, and then it ended up going down. So that's something I think we need to revitalize, and thank you for that reminder.
Good morning. Thank you. This is a great forum. My wife and I are lucky enough to have 1 foot each in Ulster County and Queens, and so we see this issue on both ends through the course of the week. I'm curious. Food is a big industry in New York. Restaurants, hospitality, some degree of food production, which is one of the niche manufacturing areas that's growing a little bit. And I'm curious, from your perspective, to what extent do you see business relationships forming between those parts of the New York City economy and Hudson Valley agricultural resources? I know there's some, but I don't have a good sense of whether there's more or less or stable, and what's being done to encourage more of those business relationships.
So it's growing. There are private for-profit companies like 5 Acre Farms, and there are distributors like up in the Hudson Valley who are beginning to aggregate local food and then label it and sell it to institutions and outlets in the city. There's a place called the Farm to Table Distribution Center in Ulster County. There's a need for more, but increasingly we are seeing that connection being strengthened in terms of private commercial entities. I think the big one of the challenges, and we talk a lot about school food in this context as well, and Karen, I think, mentioned about the need for institutions and schools to have more food. So if the school commissioner from New York City calls Chris and says, I need 3 zillion pounds of squash tomorrow, because New York City schools, I think, are second only to the Defense Department as a food supplier in this country. We have a lot of small family farms, and so it takes a lot of aggregation of small farms product to serve the larger institutions, and so that also is part of the issue.
So I'm trying to meet my 10:15 deadline. I've been pretty good at the last 4 because I usually go over. I want to take time to thank you, the panel, for coming. It's really appreciative. I really appreciate the fact that everybody has busy schedules, and to come to East Harlem is not always so easy, and we really appreciate it. I like the idea of parking passes for farmers. I think that's a great idea. So Chris, you wouldn't have had to worry. And thank you all for coming. Make sure to check out nycfoodpolicy.org, which is our website. Also, we're honoring this Thursday our 40 Under 40. Please check it out. It's fully booked at this time, so there's no seats available. But you can always see Alexina, the deputy director, and she'll work out a way for you to come in. But it's a great event at Roosevelt House from 6 to 9 this Thursday night. So thank everybody, and thanks for coming. Thank you, Steve, for setting this up.